In this video, we're going to talk about the United Nations. The United Nations is the largest multilateral organization in the world, and all countries are represented. There's two principal organs that we need to be aware of. The first is the United Nations General Assembly. This is the very large chamber that looks like a legislature. I often call it like a giant student council chamber where every country gets representation. So it's one member, one vote. It is a democratic chamber where issues called resolutions are discussed, they're debated, and they're brought for a vote. However, resolutions that are approved, votes that are taken in the United Nations General Assembly, are not binding. They're essentially meaningless. So that gives, leads to some controversy that the UN General Assembly doesn't actually do anything. On the flip side, the fact that countries are represented, there's a place where the leaders can go, mingle with each other, and connect with each other. Maybe they'll be less likely to invade one another. Now, when conflicts do occur, there needs to be a smaller body to try and deliberate. You can imagine it's difficult to get consensus with 193 countries. So when you're making meaningful decisions about sending troops places to try and remedy a conflict along a border, then you need a smaller forum for doing that. And that's the UN Security Council. The UN Security Council is the one with the teeth. When the UN Security Council votes to send troops somewhere, they will do that. And the language they use are all necessary means. When they pass a resolution that authorizes member states to take all necessary means to solve a conflict, then that's what they're doing. They're saying, let's send troops into a country or to a border dispute or what have you. Now, the UN Security Council has its own problems. While it does focus on things like peacekeeping, conflict prevention, nuclear proliferation is a big one, they will debate these and try and pass resolutions. And in order to do that, of the 15 members on the Security Council, you need 9 votes for something to pass. So it's a little more than a simple majority. We could call that a supermajority threshold. However, 5 countries have permanent seats on the Security Council, and if one of those countries votes no, then the resolution is stopped. And those are called the Permanent 5 or the P5, the US, China, the United Kingdom, Russia, and France. If one of those countries votes no on something, it's not going to happen. If it is 14 votes to do it and one of those countries votes no, then it's not going to happen. So you need 9 countries minimum, but the 5 permanent members all have to agree with something. The 10 non-permanent, the temporary members, they rotate through for 2-year terms with half the membership coming up for a vote each year. So there is some turnover on that, on the non-permanent members. What about Canada? Well, there are times when Canada has had a seat on the Security Council, and most Canadian prime ministers do try to lobby for a seat on the Security Council. And most recently in 2020, when the North American seats were vacant, Canada tried to position itself to get a seat in the sort of Americas, I should say, and it was not successful. And probably because the U.S. was mobilizing against us to make sure we didn't get it. But this is something that Canada likes to aspire to, and it gives us a seat at the table. It makes us sort of feel like we can weigh in on these issues of international significance. When we're not on the Security Council, then we're sort of, seems like we're on the sidelines. Now, the United Nations is not without its problems. For example, the governance structure. It's hard to get anything done in the Security Council. The General Assembly is relatively meaningless. And there's a Human Rights Council that tends to get populated by some of the worst human rights abusers. And so hard to take an organization seriously when you've got countries like Iran or North Korea that are involved in the Human Rights Council. Now, there are other problems in terms of their effectiveness. In 1994, the Rwandan genocide, almost 1 million people were killed. And, despite the presence of UN peacekeeping forces, most of that, about 80% of that happened in about a 3-month span. In Sri Lanka, we had thousands of citizens killed in a UN-administered safe zone. Sudan, 2003, hundreds of thousands of dead in the Darfur region. Yemen, ongoing conflict. And the UN, despite the seeming capability of getting involved in solving these problems, doesn't really follow through. And that could be just the nature of the Security Council. And often when troops are sent to places for peacekeeping, they have a very limited mandate. They might be they can't engage with belligerents and they can't fire first. And there's all kinds of limitations around what they can actually do. So when the UN does decide to intervene and solve problems and to try and reduce conflict, it's not very good at it. Just to recap, the United Nations, global multilateral organization where all countries are represented, 2 principal organs, that General Assembly, where each country gets a vote, and then, of course, the more exclusive Security Council with 15 seats and those 5 permanent members that have the real power. There's some challenges with governance, the way that organizations are run within the UN, and its overall effectiveness. Can it actually do the things that it tries to do?